Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business, innovation, and managing life. Let's see, we have a number of questions saved up here. Gosh, from Alp, what are your top picks for startup ideas for Mathematica and Wolfram language users? Oh boy. There's so much open territory. I suppose the general thing to say is take a thing that one is doing, whether it and ask how can it be made computational. Take something where perhaps there's been kind of specific code written for particular cases. Ask how do you make kind of a computational representation of what has to be done to make it much more general. I think that this is a very broad area. If people want to ask about more specific areas, I think it'd be easier to answer. The way to think about things is how do you make that computable, whatever that is. And often it's a question of, well, how do you represent things in a computational way? Then what operations do you want to do on those things? So an example, every company has some kind of transactions processing system. We've had a big, complicated such system. Often they're called ERP systems. I think enterprise resource planning. I don't know who made up that buzzword. It's not a particularly good one, but it's basically things that process transactions, know about orders and customers, kind of have all of the kind of the internal, that kind of internal data in a company. We had such a system, kind of old creaky thing that was one of the standard such systems for many years. Decided about 5 years ago, we're just going to rewrite that using Wolfram language. And it's very interesting when you say, let's modernize it. Let's say we're going to represent products. We want to represent a product that we sell with all kinds of different options and configurations and so on. That becomes represented as a symbolic expression in Wolfram language. And then, well, what can we do with it? Well, we have, we sort of poke at it with different operations and we say, and then in the end, we have something that sort of is specifying something like, how much should this thing cost? I want to buy this with all these different options and so on and so on. How much should it cost? You have to make a pricing algorithm that you can make that kind of ingests these symbolic representations of products and then has a whole collection of rules that say how one would work out that pricing. And then there are questions like, well, there are theorems that should be true about that pricing, that you can't spend less by getting more type thing, those kinds of things. And then you can actually take that pricing engine symbolically represented with a bunch of symbolic rules and these potential products represented symbolically, and you can use theorem proving to try and determine whether that attribute is true. And you can also do lots of other things where you're kind of using that symbolic structure and you're visualizing different kinds of things. You're just being able to make use of all of those capabilities once you have things in this computable form. Another thing about, for example, the ERP system is the thinking about what to do with kind of corner case situations. The company that has 4 branches in different countries with different rules about how things are sold and pricing and so on. And how do you make something which is an aggregate sale, let's say, to those different things? Well, that's a sort of corner case that hadn't shown up. Or maybe there's something where somebody is buying some product and they're going to use it on a ship that's going to go from here to there. And that's sort of a special case. And how do you deal with that? Well, a very common thing is that you would say, okay, I'm going to have this system. It's going to be used by a customer service group. It's going to have a bunch of screens and you click, whatever. And to know what to do in the case where you have all these different countries involved. Oh, yes, let me find somebody who's been around the customer service group a long time. And they know that on screen 14 in this corner, you have click this button and then this happens and so on. It's rather arcane. The thing that we realized, having sort of built this kind of symbolic ERP system, was that we could expect everything is represented by code. And then we have notebooks that contain sort of examples of different transactions that have been done. And so then for customer service, they just have to find a notebook of something similar and they modify the code. And it turns out, well, maybe it's sort of modern times and it's also because it's Wolfram language code and it's pretty easy to modify. It's perfectly feasible for somebody who's in customer service team, for example, to modify that code. And then it's a question of, well, you have to have some validation mechanism, possibly it involves humans, more likely it's automatic, that says, yes, this code didn't do something crazy, press go, and then it becomes sort of an active thing. But that thinking of how one can deal with that, whether it's, oh yeah, we got to build a user interface with 50 screens and so on, or whether it's just code that's designed code that represents that deals with these symbolic expressions. You think differently when you're thinking about doing things in Wolfram language as kind of this sort of high level construction and so on. And I mean, I think they're just an incredible range of opportunities in all sorts of different industries, and things in education, things in manufacturing, things in pick an area, things in services. I mean, there's a lot in kind of the automation of data science and kind of very multi-paradigm data science where you're pulling in you're pulling in images and text and numerical data and so on. There's just a lot of different possibilities. It's a huge and very very promising collection of opportunities. Let's see. Well, there's a question from C here. What's the future looking like for entrepreneurial business ventures and technology ones in particular, given what's happening with tools, capital, more solopreneurs, more big VC, neither? Yeah, I mean, okay, there are multiple things to say here. It's like one thing is, what's the minimum viable business? What do you need to put a shingle up to sort of be able to have your business be runnable? And as more and more tools and automation are available and more sort of software as a service services, things like that, the kind of size of team and the amount of capital you need to sort of put up something has gone down. And it's certainly true very much with our technology stack that many people have done this, that an individual person can put in the creativity that they want to put in and build something that is a practical thing that is polished enough that it can be actually put out there and used. And that's something that I think is sort of it's there's a strand of entrepreneurial efforts where it's really true that the product is almost one person buildable, given all the automation that exists, all the tooling, all the services, and so on. Now, it's one thing to have the product be buildable that way. It's another to let the world know about that product and to have any way to kind of communicate about it. And there's sort of different ways that happens. I mean, sometimes there'll be something where there's some particular, oh, it's such a cool idea that it's virally talked about. And it really doesn't take a lot of human effort. It takes, the good idea that gets out there in social media and so on, and then takes off of its own accord. One's lucky when that happens. And that's sort of, there can be a single, person behind the curtain, so to speak, and then lots of stuff happening. In the case where you sort of need to do more kind of, pounding the pavement, actually getting out there and doing things, that can take a lot more human effort. Just as on the side of what you're building, depending on the details of what you're building, that also could take a lot more human effort. There are cases where it's just the good idea, the implementation, the viral thing that gets started, and it's sort of off to the races on its own. The modern world is such that that's conceivable. In the past, where there was sort of less connectivity of the world, that really wasn't conceivable because, to just deal with the distribution channels, maybe you're sending out physical material, you have to buy it. There's a complicated cash flow issue with that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I have to say, there are cases where I can see where somebody could sort of, put up the shingle easily as lots of work, but a sort of a one person or few people kind of operation. But they say, I don't really want to do that. I want somebody to put up the money to let me have a plusher version of getting this thing started, not the same kind of grassroots startup. And I think there's a certain institutionalized version of that, of sort of, are you validated enough by having somebody say, oh, I'm going to put hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars into this thing. That's when I'm going to press go and really do it, as opposed to I'm going to do it as a hobby, alongside my day job and so on, and, let it develop to the point where I can sort of put a shingle up without having to make the sort of full commitment and without having investors investing and so on. The scene of kind of investment and how that works and what the expectations are has definitely changed over time. I think that, there was a time when I started my first company in 1981. There was venture capital, just like there is today. It was mostly in New York in those days, not in San Francisco and so on. But it was, but it was not everybody does startups and everybody knows how it works, and you do your seed, you do your series A, you do your whatever, all this terminology of startups that developed in subsequent years. And startups got kind of industrialized to the point where, there are classes about how to make your startup, and there are all these sort of processes you go through. I think my friend Paul Graham and his Y Combinator effort was sort of one of the things that kind of industrialized kind of the concept of tech startups and so on, of just like there's this process, you go through this, you do that, and then you have a startup. I'm not sure how healthy that's been, because there are, sometimes I have to say at times I've like, there are things where it could have been a web page or it could have been a startup. And it really is more like a web page, but it's themed as a startup because that's what people do. And that's sometimes, I'm not sure how healthy that is. But I think, kind of this idea of all these sort of ecosystems of startups and funding for startups and angel funding and so on is, there's a sort of institutionalized character to some of it. That I'm not sure how healthy it is, because I think an awful lot more startups get done than probably makes sense. And the question is sort of, there's this trade-off between it being so hard to do a startup that even the ones that are really worthwhile don't get done. And it's so easy that lots get done that shouldn't be done. But maybe some of the ones that sort of get done, even though they shouldn't, actually turn out to be a worthwhile thing in the end. So it's kind of a complicated trade-off. But in terms of what people, the kind of the trends and what's happening, I don't know. I mean, there are different trends. I mean, like software startups, lots of automation and tooling makes it a lot easier to do a much leaner startup. There's been a trend in recent times to have hardware startups. They have typically some minimum cost, although you can outsource kind of you can say, I just have this idea, let me outsource by putting up some money for it, outsource the actual engineering of this idea and the manufacturing of this idea and so on. And so again, that can be done in a fairly lean way. I think in the world of kind of the usual cycle of companies has been somewhat disrupted. I mean, the usual cycle was, oh, you get some seed financing, then you get venture capital and you put some number of millions of dollars into things, and then you have a few rounds of venture capital, and eventually the company goes public, and then after some period, the founders can kind of have kind of liquidity, and they can sell some of their stock or whatever, and they get rich type thing. And that cycle has been somewhat disrupted because being a public company is a less and less appealing thing, I think, to people because of all kinds of regulatory issues, etc., and simply costs associated with going public. It's all kind of complicated and expensive. And so an increasing number of companies are staying kind of private for a long period of time. And then the question is, well, what happens to all, let's say, the employees who have options and shares and so on? Can they actually make money from that, or are they just waiting forever? I mean, and so then what developed is these kind of private markets for people to sell shares even when the company isn't public. And it's kind of like a miniature version of being public, except it's not the real public. It's just a set of sort of qualified investors with enough assets and so on, and insiders And so that's become sort of a separate ecosystem where companies that get very large and don't go public. I think a thing that, if you take my company, for example, I've been lucky enough to have a company for the last 38 years without any outside investors, which makes my life much simpler because I'm kind of my own boss. And it's my fault, if we don't do as well as we might, or we decide not to pursue something that could be really commercially successful, even though it might not be something we find terribly interesting. It's in a situation where there are investors to satisfy, that would be a horrifying thing to do. It's kind of like, you're responsible for doing good things with the money that was invested in your company. But if there isn't money invested in you, then you kind of don't have that responsibility. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, has been a terrific sort of life deal over the last more than, well, nearly 4 decades now. And I think I've noticed in very recent times, last few years, an increasing number of kind of tech companies where their founders really want to do that kind of thing, to have a long-term kind of private company that has to make money by making money, so to speak. It's not, a lot of companies go through many rounds of investment where the company is like, it has great promise, but it didn't actually make a profit ever. And it's kind of being fueled by increasing rounds of investment, and increasing fractions of the company are owned by the investors. And that's kind of it's something where if you're going to do it the other way, where you are actually funding the company organically from profits and so on, that the growth that you can get is much smaller, but it is still something where you retain your freedom, so to speak. And I think that in recent times, I've certainly been contacted by an increasing number of entrepreneurs who say, help me figure out how to do this for what I'm doing, and who kind of are more interested in doing something interesting than they are in perhaps maximizing their returns. Now, for somebody like me, have a company, private company for all these years, it's like the company's probably worth a fair amount of money. I don't know how much, but it's that's not, I don't have money from that, so to speak. The only money I make from the company is from profits of the company and so on, not from something where I'm sort of selling stock in the company to other people. That's a calculation one makes. It's more interesting and freer life, less money. And for me personally, that's been a good trade-off. I think that for other people, it would be like, you're just crazy. Why aren't you sort of finding ways to get liquidity or get kind of cash out of something that's quite valuable? Why aren't you doing that now rather than in the infinite future, so to speak? Well, I don't really intend to do that ever. I'm more interested in having a more interesting company, so to speak. And I think that, to the extent to which that's possible in modern times, it's enhanced by the fact that it's become cheaper to get to the point where you can have something that is a viable company, even without the sort of huge investment. You're not building a factory. You're not paying for, building inventory or something. You're not paying for splashy ads. There are a lot of things that used to cost a lot of money that really don't anymore. And where it's really a question of just sort of doing the right thing, good things, rather than it is just sort of throwing money at something to make things happen. Now, it's so, I mean, those are a few thoughts, but I think that the world of sort of the standard pattern of venture capital has been somewhat disrupted. I mean, by all sorts of different means of funding and more kind of and the fact that some of the venture capital funds are victims of their own success because they have such huge funds that they can't really, it's very difficult to invest in a startup where really you should be putting in $2 million, let's say, but you have a multi-$10 billion fund. And it's a huge amount of work to go and sort of put $2 million here, $2 million there, and so on. And you really want to put much larger lumps of money, which you really can't do for early stage startups, at least in most cases. I mean, I think in the AI world, there are an increasing number of startups that have huge amounts of money in the early stages, because there are venture funds and so on that can do that. But I think in many cases, you're really making bets at a much later stage where it really makes sense to put 50 or $100 million into something because it's well enough developed for that to be the something meaningful, and it's not something where you're giving, two guys or two gals and a dog or something, $50 million, hoping that they will emerge from their garage with something wonderful. That's an odd bet to make. Putting the 50 or $100 million into a company that's a running company with customers and this and that and the other makes a lot more sense. But if you're trying to distribute, $10 billion or something, then you tend to want to do it in larger lumps. And the actual dynamics of how venture capitalists make money also requires that you have these big funds, you charge management fees and so on, and you kind of have to do stuff. And it's hard to do that in little small increments. People certainly try and with some success, but I think that piece of the ecosystem, because of the kind of the scale of venture capital has grown, it's that smaller funding tends to go to other kinds of folk. And then there are, different kinds of folk who are, people who've been in the tech industry, made some money and now do investing, to people who are sort of outside of the tech industry and have some money and sort of hope that they can pick the right tech companies, people who are greatly involved in the companies they invest in, people who are not so involved. I'm not sure which of those is the better place to be, because sometimes there are people who are really successfully helpful. Sometimes they are simply meddlesome. And sometimes they have an idea because it's like, well, when I did my company, it worked like this. And yes, if you were doing your company again, that would be a good idea. But this is a different entrepreneur with different personality, different things they can do. And maybe that's not such a good thing to suggest. So a few thoughts about that. Let's see. Lily asks, in business, do you think it's better to try to start a business with a totally new idea that hasn't been done before, or to reinvent an old idea your way? Well, I mean, for me, based on my calculation of what's worth spending one's life doing, I'm much more interested in these things that one might view as sort of alien artifacts of things where nobody imagined that that was a thing you could make before. I mean, for me, for my particular kind of egotistical turn of mind, the idea that I'm doing something that nobody would have done it if I wasn't doing it is much more attractive. But it's not obvious that that is the right thing to do from a commercial point of view. Quite often, there are, certainly I've been on the other side of this issue of, you do things where you are the first to do it, and it's a very interesting thing, and you do it, and then sort of the kind of the not the pioneers, but the kind of the town builders come in, and then something gets built that is sort of a much more commercially successful thing, where somebody else did the pioneering and took all the risks for pioneering the thing, and now there's a thing that has been considerably de-risked, where somebody can come in and competently execute on it and produce something that's much more commercially successful. I mean, I think it's something of a personal decision what kind of businesses one goes after, and I'm much more interested in pioneering kinds of things than in sort of development kinds of things. But it's there are lots of trade-offs. I mean, the types of people who will be drawn to, in terms of employees and so on, who will be drawn to, we're doing it for the first time, it's an exciting mission, versus we're building the thing, it's going to make a bunch of money, but it's kind of like we know the rules, we know what has to be built. Different types of people. And, for leadership of those companies, sometimes people find it much easier to manage people who are motivated by kind of the money they'll make from doing what they're doing. Sometimes people find it much easier to manage people who are motivated by the excitement of the mission of what they're doing. I think it's rather dependent on the people who are managing the company and what they want to do and are able to do. I mean, I think that another thing that's an interesting trap is there's an idea, it was tried, it didn't work. And then sometimes there's a kind of a shadow cast for decades from that idea. Oh, that idea didn't work, so there's no reason to try it again. Well, sometimes that's completely wrong, because maybe when it was tried before, the people who tried it just were not very competent. Maybe when it was tried before, the world was different and you couldn't kind of execute on that kind of thing. Maybe there's some piece of technology that finally makes it possible to do something that one couldn't do before. I mean, for example, there were endless chatbots before ChatGPT and the whole LLM situation. Those chatbots sort of didn't work terribly well. I mean, there were a few cases where they sort of slightly worked for customer service purposes or for sort of toy companionship purposes and so on. But they weren't nearly as strong as they are now. And that's something where one could have spent a lot of time building those kinds of things, and just the technology just wasn't there to do it. The same, you know, in every industry, that kind of thing happens. And you could have said, look, chatbots just are not useful. You know, we should never build a chatbot. And that wouldn't have been correct, but it would have been correct given the technology situation that existed. And I think it's always you know, there are lots of opportunities that open up when there is a new kind of technology that arrives, like the kind of modern AI, LLM world and so on. There are lots of new opportunities that open up where it's worth rethinking kind of, in a sense, old ideas based on new technology and seeing, well, now that we have this technology, could we rethink that particular thing and execute it differently? I mean, there are endless examples of this from the Ubers and Lyfts of this world, sort of rethinking the kind of limousine business or something to lots of different kinds of things where sort of the existence of some new technology, or maybe a change in the way the world works that isn't just technology related, makes it sort of opens up a new possibility. And I think that's so in a sense, is it an old idea? Well, it was an idea that maybe just couldn't be executed at the time when it was first considered. Maybe it had outright failed back in those days. I mean, a good example of something which is porpoising, in the sense going up and down over the course of years, is VR, AR, kinds of virtual reality, augmented reality, and so on. It's kind of like, yes, there was a thing with VR in the beginning of the 1990s, and it sort of didn't make it at that time, except in very niche areas. And then it's kind of reappeared multiple times. And, eventually, I'm sure it will make it. Whether that time of making it is now is very unclear. And once it makes it, that will, for example, enable lots of opportunities for businesses and so on. And just like mobile enabled lots of opportunities for things where sort of one had done it some way before. Even the web, for example, took many things that people had done differently before, and now you could refactor it for the web. Same with cloud computing, same with mobile, to some extent, same with blockchain, etc. Each of these kind of new enabling technologies lets one sort of refactor things. I like to think that our own computational language efforts provide another such opportunity to kind of refactor things one was doing some other way before. I mean, I view kind of what we're doing as what enables kind of computational X for all X. And given your field X, how do you think about the computational version of that field using computational language to get to the point of being able to have computational X? I think that provides a lot of very interesting opportunities. And it's kind of another place where you kind of get to rethink things based on a different kind of infrastructure for building stuff. Let's see. Let's see. Question from LC here. How do you advise young people with a similar all-consuming intrinsic compulsion as yours, but be it in their quest for knowledge and understanding or otherwise, and going about their careers and their lives? Gosh, these things are very personality dependent. I mean, there are people who really, they have a thing they really want to do, and that's the only thing they want to do. And you can try and get them to be in school and do what they do in school, but it's just never going to work. They have to do the thing that they really want to do. And then sort of navigating the world to be able to do that is it's a complicated puzzle in many cases. There are aspects of things one might want to do in the world for which you kind of need some level of certification because that's just the way the world works. That's kind of awkward. There are other places where, if you're going to do a tech startup, for example, nobody says do you have an MBA if you're going to do your tech startup? Nobody would, well, nobody sensible would ask that. If you're the 16-year-old and you're really driven to do this tech startup, you should just do it. And there's nothing in the world that stops you doing that. It's a different thing if you want to be, oh, I don't know, if you want to do something that is if you have some great medical idea that you want to execute and you need to be an actual MD to be able to be in a position where you can do anything with it, that's one thing. Or you need to have, some qualification. If you're going to do something that's kind of that has to exist in the academic world, you probably need to go and get a PhD so you can become a professor and things like this. But there's an awful lot of things that one can do where having some qualification, it doesn't really make any difference. And so sort of a direct path to do the thing you want to do is often a very good thing. I must say in my own case, I wanted to be a physicist when I was a kid, when I was, 10, 11, 12 years old and so on. And I guess that I went to good schools and so on. And I suppose that I guess with my particular personality, I kind of like doing stuff well. And in lots of different kinds of things of learning Latin and Greek and things like that, I would complain about it, but still it kind of helps that I have a good memory and things like this. I got some satisfaction out of doing these things well, not competitively well, although that wasn't my motivation. My motivation was just I like doing stuff well, and I also happen to have a good memory, so it was sort of easy for me to to do these things fairly well. And I think I managed to kind of suffer that, and I have to say, back in the day, sort of I would say that even the fanciest schools were a lot less all-consuming than schools are today. So I would do my schoolwork and so on, and then I would spend time doing like physics and so on. I had plenty of time to do that. It wasn't like I was every hour of every day was taken up with the schoolwork and the extracurricular activity and this and that and the other thing. I think because sort of this, I don't know, some kind of inflation has happened, that sort of there's increasing busyness on the part of younger people, which I think is a shame, because I think that while in some cases it's kind of like good because for some young people it's like, well, it keeps them out of trouble because they're just so busy doing the things they're supposed to do that they can't sort of spin off and do and get themselves in trouble. On the other hand, for those who want to have sort of the opportunity to kind of think and so on, if every hour of every day is scheduled with this or that thing, you have no opportunity to do something creative, sort of that is driven by yourself. You're being always externally driven, which I think is a shame. And I think it certainly helped me. I think it's helped my kids that they've had the opportunity to do things which are sort of where they can do it because they are motivated to do it, not because that got scheduled as a thing from the outside world, so to speak. And I think but this question of sort of do you do the things you need to do to sort of go through the rungs of the ladder in the world? I think it is somewhat dependent. If your compulsion leads you to something that is going to be very quickly successful, it is less important to have climbed the rungs of the ladder, because you're not going to be interviewing for a job if you started your own company and you're CEOing it. Nobody's interviewing you for a job in that case. But if you are not, if that isn't going to work and you're in a situation where, yes, you've got to get a job and people are going to interview you and they're going to say, did you go to school and blah blah blah, then that's important to have done that. But I think then there's the question of, well, do you learn what you need to learn? And I have to say, in my own case, as I say, my real interest was doing physics and so on, and but I happened to go to good schools, and the other stuff, I was sufficiently interested in it that yes, I learned all kinds of other things that at the time I thought were quite useless. Later on, they've turned out to be pretty useful, and the fact that I learned them was a good thing. But I've also found that as you go through and do different kinds of things, for me at least, even the principle that one goes on learning is already gets one a long way, because it's like, well, I've learned a bunch of specific things. And then, well, eventually it comes up, actually, I need to know something about chemistry, let's say, or actually, I need to know something about accounting, let's say. Well, the fact that I have kind of a life experience of just learning new things means, well, yeah, that's a thing I can learn, and I'm going to learn it even if I'm, 50 years old or whatever. It's like, okay, I've got a new thing to learn, I'm going to learn it. And that I'm kind of used to the rhythm of yes, I'm going to keep on learning new things. And I think that makes it less important to have learned all those things early on. And I certainly in that some people have the point of view that you go to school, you're 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 filled up with learning, and then you don't have to learn anymore for the rest of your life. You just do stuff. I think, personally, it's not at all what I've ended up doing. I've been keeping on learning new kinds of things throughout my life, so to speak. I think that's fun. Maybe not everybody does. Maybe some people find the act of learning sufficiently kind of difficult that they just want to let's finish that in the first couple of decades of life and then not have to do that anymore. It's but if once you're committed to the idea that you're going to keep on learning, it's kind of less important what you got filled up with in the first 2 decades of life, so to speak. It's you could have learned only very specific things. You didn't learn all this other stuff, but you're going to go on learning things. So if you end up needing to learn one of those other things, you can. I think that in it does have a certain you have to have a certain mindset to be prepared to start from scratch learning something. The other thing that I've noticed, by the time you've learnt X number of fields, where X may be kind of large, the X plus one field that you try to learn is easier. Although it's never trivial. There's always bumps. There are always things that are difficult to understand, and I haven't thought that way before, and so on. But I think the other thing that happens is I think just a certain amount of personal maturity makes it easier to learn things. I mean, I've noticed that things I learned when I was a kid, and it's kind of that was difficult to learn, and then I kind of am relearning it for some reason or another at a much later stage. It's often a lot easier. It's maybe that's just because one knows more and there's more to sort of anchor the new things one's learning onto. But a few thoughts about that. Let's see. Leonardo asks, if you're debating the efficiency of algorithm design with your team, how do you navigate conflicting feedback? Well, I guess for me, that's very visible because I live stream a lot of our internal software design meetings and so on. So one can kind of see what happens. Let's see if I can describe what happens, and you can validate or not that by actually watching these live streams. I think, usually in one of these areas, somebody's going to come with a theory for what should be done. Sometimes that somebody is me, sometimes it's somebody else. And then there's, okay, should we do this or not? And it's a question of, well, somebody will say this, somebody else will say that. I'll have an opinion. It's kind of like you have to talk it out. Now, there are different personalities of people. Like you'll find on our live streams, there are people who are, you have to pull out of them that they don't agree. And other people will be like, very vigorously saying, no, that's nonsense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is sometimes challenging because you kind of have to know the people you're working with enough to know when somebody is just silent, maybe that means they don't agree. And when somebody else is like, making this big fuss and so on, maybe that means that they sort of don't agree, but they're not really sure. And the loudness of their objection doesn't necessarily translate into the conviction that they have about that objection. So it's a somewhat tricky thing because you kind of have to know the people you're working with. And for me, it always takes a little while when I start working with a new person to sort of get their number well enough that I have some sense of, if they say it's just impossible, does that mean they didn't even think about it yet? Does that mean they really thought about it and they're really telling me something that I'm going to agree with in the end, or something intermediate, or something completely different? And that translation of what's said to what's actually meant is always tricky and is personality dependent. I don't know a way to kind of streamline that. I think you just have to know the people you're working with to some extent. And I think it's and people will sometimes be, like they vigorously disagree. Well, you have to pick it apart and see what everybody is saying, and eventually, sometimes you just have to say, look, we're going to do this because, I'm pretty sure this is right, and it's not worth us spending any more time on this. And this is what we're going to do. And that's kind of you have to have established enough leadership that you can do that, and that people aren't like, if you have somebody who's making suggestions and you keep on turning down their suggestions, this is not going to go well. And, and honestly, then that person is probably in the wrong place, because if they keep on making suggestions that sort of aren't right, they should be doing something different. If you are sort of capriciously deciding that, oh, I don't like this person's suggestions every time, then that's a bad thing. And that's not going to work out. But I think I tend to think that there are, I suppose for me, and I hope for the team, it is not a question of ego of did my suggestion get used? It's a question of did we do the right thing? And so long as one can have kind of leadership and culture where it's really like we're all really excited about doing the right thing, that's more important than whether my suggestion worked or your suggestion worked. I mean, I think it's always a good sign when somebody has made a suggestion. They've got this thing and they're whatever, and you point out this or that thing about it, and they're like, oh yeah, that's right, thank you. That's a good sign. That's a sign that that was a good interaction, where it wasn't like the person who made the suggestion was like, oh, my ego is damaged, my suggestion wasn't taken. It was, look, we managed to get to a better place because we made use of somebody else's expertise, and that allowed us to get a better result. Let's see. Taking some questions that came in more recently here. It's a question from Bob. Do you, me, have a innately good memory, or do you use memory tricks? I use absolutely no memory tricks. I can't remember any memory tricks. I think I just have a pretty good memory, although I can say that sometimes my memory is more visual, sometimes it's more sound-based. I'll remember the name sounds like this more or less, but I don't have a visual impression of it. Sometimes I'll be like, the book looks like that type thing. I know when I was a young kid, I had some kind of sort of eidetic memory to some extent, at least, because I could like look at a page of text and then read off the text, at least when it was big print text. Very confusing for teachers, very confusing for me, because I didn't realize all kids couldn't do that. And as soon as I realized all kids couldn't do it, it started evaporating for me too. So unfortunately, perhaps. But I think, part of what helps me, so I can't remember things unless those things sort of pass through my brain in some way. I mean, in other words, if it's just like a read this table of facts and I don't really internalize those facts, I'm not going to remember them. I think it helps that sort of the more you know, the easier it is to know more things, because there's more sort of attachment points where the thing you just learnt kind of like, oh yeah, that attaches to this place. I mean, perhaps as we learn more about machine learning and so on, and as we learn more about how knowledge is represented in machine learning, we might learn more about how that works for us. I mean, my own view about machine learning these days, having recently studied kind of the foundations of machine learning, trying to understand something that people have had a really hard time understanding, which is why machine learning works. My feeling is that you're taking these kind of lumps of computation that are these sort of funny shaped lumps of computation, and you're finding for the particular thing you want to do, here's how I can fit these lumps that happen to exist together to achieve the thing I want to achieve. And it's kind of almost like when we build up memories, we've got these kind of little lumps of computation, which we say, yes, that one is a thing that relates to the world. That's going to be, I'm going to put that in here, but it's a kind of weird lump of computation that represents this memory in some way that is very not, it has sort of extra attributes that are not to do with the memory itself, And I don't yet understand how really that fits together and works, and what that means about sort of a picture of how we remember what we remember, and so on, and what the kind of likely errors of remembering are. I mean, I happen to have, so I have a good memory for names, although I find it easier to remember names that are, for example, names that are not that are in unfamiliar languages and things. I find much more difficult to remember than names that are kind of like names I've heard a lot of before. For example, I'm really bad with faces. It's embarrassingly bad, honestly, with them. But that's why I'm like, for goodness sake, if I'm going to some event, I hope everybody will wear a name tag, because once I see the name, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. But the face, it's like, oh, I don't know who this is. And particularly if some superficial aspect of appearance has changed, it's like I'm totally going to lose it. I think that um, I would say the main thing about remembering things, as far as I'm concerned, is caring about what one is trying to remember. In other words, just sort of the raw, let me remember this for the sake of remembering it. I'm not going to be able to do that. But somehow, I don't know, things do sort of sit there even though you don't intend to. For example, one thing that I suppose amuses the young is, the fact that I remember area codes. Like, I'll see some phone number and it's okay, that's area code 212. That, it's New York, it's area code 213, it's Los Angeles, it's 617, it's Boston, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I probably know most of at least the older area codes, even though I certainly made no effort at any time to sit down and look at a list of area codes and remember them. If I had done that, there's no way I would remember them. And why that particular thing ended up in piece of residual memory, even though I never really made an effort to learn it, I can't really say. I think that sometimes, well, I'm pretty decent at remembering facts. I'm not very good at remembering, for example, sequences of how things happened. So in other words, if you say, what happened first, this, or this, the only way I can figure that out often is to actually understand the sort of causal relationship between that happening and that happening. It's not, I don't, but some people I think are pretty good at remembering the sequence of things that happened. If you said, well, what did you do? What meetings did you do today? Well, I probably will remember the facts of what happened in those meetings. The fact that they were today rather than yesterday, rather than the day before, I quite probably will not remember unless I think about it and are able to hook that to something else I know. And I think, different people have different kinds of memories, and it's probably useful to know what kind of memory you have, just like it's useful to know what kinds of mistakes you make. I mean, I know for writing code, for example, I've long ago learnt, the kinds of mistakes I make. And so I kind of learn to look for those types of mistakes, and then I don't make those so much anymore. And, similarly, there are situations I'll get into where it's like, this is a situation where I will not be able to do well. If somebody says, be on a panel and have a discussion with a bunch of people, and that's not a situation where I will do well, or do some particular kind of thing where I'm, making some ceremonial comment, for example, at some event. I don't do that terribly well unless I prepared it very carefully and have something very definite to say. I'm not very good at that kind of thing. So it's kind of like, learn the things that one is good at and one isn't good at, and try to avoid putting oneself in situations where one is kind of forcing oneself into things one isn't very good at doing. And I think that's it's the same thing with kind of remembering things, that there are cases where I know I'm going to be able to remember something fairly well, and there are cases where, like I don't know, something like, oh, where did I park my car? If my car has some ability for me to find it, so to speak. But if it's like, some underground parking garage or something, and it's like, where did I park it? I'm not going to remember that. I write it down. I know the more modern people take a picture of it, but I'm always loath to fill up my photo list with pictures of of parked car information. But it's that's the type of thing where I know I'm not going to remember. So I always have a piece of paper in my pocket. I've done that for probably, oh gosh, probably 50 years by now, of just a folded piece of paper in my pocket, and I have a pen and I just write down, that piece of information, and then I know, oh, where is my car? There's a very giant underground parking garage or something, and I'll take out my piece of paper and I'll be able to see the number because I know I will have put it there. Let's see. Um, just a question about me from the Ruliad, good name. Did you ever play an instrument? Yeah, I learnt piano for a while. I think I was good at it and wasn't interested in it, which was not a great combination. And I kind of gave it up and haven't really uh, uh, haven't done that ever since. I think it was one of those cases of a kid should do this, but the kid didn't really want to do it in this particular case. And had I had, perhaps at a different time in my life, had I been more internally motivated, I think it would have gone a lot better. Um, let's see. 420 asks, how do you develop speed reading and improve memory for students or anyone who wants to be better off intellectually? I don't think I'm a very fast reader. I'm a pretty fast scanner of things, but I tend to have two modes of reading things. I'm either like reading every word and, or I am just sort of scanning for content where I'm trying to look at the pictures more or less. I mean, I would say it's terrible. It sounds very childish that oftentimes I'll be looking at some, sophisticated technical document and I'm basically just scanning through and looking at the pictures. And, I'll only kind of read the text if I don't understand what's in the picture. And similarly, if it's some more sort of mathematically oriented thing, I'll be scanning for the equations more or less and only read the words if I have to. That's sort of one approach is just scan for content where I kind of have a theory of what I want to get out of the document. And in other cases, it's like, well, I just have to, sometimes I know that I have to dive deep into the document. If it's something where I'm trying to understand some piece of history and I'm trying to like figure out what did these people actually say, I know I'm going to have to read every word. Similarly, if it's some contract or something where, well, hopefully most of the time I'm not reading those myself, but where it's a thing where you're going to read it carefully, or some piece of explanatory documentation or user experience design or something like this, where it's like, yes, I should read every word because every word is going to count and every word that's wrong will confuse people or something. And so that's sort of a different mode of reading that I'm sure is 10 times slower than my just scan for content based on something I already I have a theory about what I'm trying to get out of this document, and then I'm just kind of almost like an artificial LLM or something, going through and trying to extract the pieces of information that that I want. Let's see. Um, uh, oh boy, there's a question here from Luisa. What financial advice would you offer to someone developing a new business idea with limited capital? Well, figure out how to do things as cheaply as possible. And I think is about the only thing one can say. I mean, I think that it's always complicated. Like, for example, you get other people involved, you know, you get them involved on a promise of something, and how and do you make sure that everybody really comes out feeling like everything worked well? I have to say, in situations I've been in there, even though thankfully it hasn't happened in years, but even though sort of I was very, very careful in kind of, hey, this is, you're going to do this in return for this, and this is what to expect, and so on, even though I was very careful in all of that. In cases where there's success, doesn't happen when there's failure. Nobody cares in that case. But when there's success, people are like, oh, but I should be getting more. And even though it was, everything was very kind of clearly spelled out, and it was kind of, you said, do you really understand? And this and that and the other, you still get sort of, I don't know whether it's true misunderstanding or whether it's greed that ends up getting in the way. And when things are successful, it ends up being sort of there's lots of crazy trouble. So it's always complicated. But I always feel like it's important, if you're getting other people involved on a promise of something, that you make every effort to make it clear and to think through, what will be the thing that they get if it works out, and maybe what do they get if it doesn't work out, and so on. And certainly there are ways to spend less cash if there are other people who want to make the bet along with you, so to speak. I think in it's always complicated because sometimes those things are sort of Faustian bargains where you're getting something cheap now in return for selling your soul to the devil later type thing. And it's and so that's a tricky thing to navigate. And I think it's uh, I don't really know a great solution to that other than to say that sometimes even if there's trouble later, but there's trouble when there's grand success, it's then that's a little bit of a cost of success is, well, yes, you didn't have to, you got to the success, but you did some things sloppily at the beginning, and now you have to spend something to fix that. I mean, I know in my company, when we started out, we built a bunch of HR systems and accounting systems and so on, and they were scrappy and sloppy, but they did fine for what we needed at that time. When the company grew, there were all kinds of things that hadn't been really quite done right and really needed to be fixed, and sometimes had to be gone back on and redo this thing and so on. But that was okay. That was doable at a point when the company was significantly larger, had much larger resources. It was just a cost of that scrappy startup, so to speak. And I think that was a good calculation, better than, oh, let's raise more money and let's light this fuse that's going to blow up because we raised this money and we have obligations to investors and things like this. Much better to have things be kind of scrappy. And if the business never really takes off, you never have to fix those things. It doesn't matter. If the business stays as a 20-person business, for example, you don't have to have all of those pieces of machinery for HR reviews or some such other thing, all carefully organized. It's just like, oh yeah, somebody remembers that and they got it on a piece of paper somewhere or something. But but by the time you're of a larger scale, it's easy to go back. It's a little painful and annoying, but it is certainly easy to withstand going back and doing those things and fixing them. So I think sort of doing things scrappily at the beginning and saving money that way, and if it gets bigger, you go back and fix it later, even if in the long view it might have been cheaper to do it. In the total amount of dollars spent, you might have spent less dollars altogether by doing it right at the beginning, but those $25,000 that it would have taken you to do it right at the beginning, you didn't have $25,000 then. You had $10,000 then, and you couldn't have done that the right way then. But later on, when you've got millions of dollars to spend, the $25,000 to go fix it is nothing. So I think that's that would be my comment on that. Let's see. Katie says, when you run a business that provides a web service to international users, are you bound to comply with the laws of all the countries where the service is accessed? Boy, let me think about that. That's complicated. I mean, I know that I don't know the answer fully. I mean, I know that there are, for example, in China, we've certainly had many issues that, if the website is being accessed from China and the server is in the US, that's one thing. If the website is being hosted, let's say in China, that's a different thing. There's, just like in the US, I think if you make a radio station, you have to get all kinds of government certification types of things. If you put up a website, I believe, and it's true, and still in China, you have to have, I think it's called an ICP number that sort of appears in the bottom of the website, and that's some kind of government certification that you're allowed to do this, and there are all kinds of constraints on doing it, and so on. I think that if you're kind of delivering web materials from the outside, I think that's less true. Now, there probably are places where there is content, and this has certainly been true for social media companies. One could see that with all the adventures with X in Brazil and who knows what else, that there are cases where there are local laws that say you can't do this, you shouldn't do that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a complicated can of worms that I'm not well equipped to discuss. I think the thing that I will say as a practical matter, um, the sort of you the what's much more complicated is if you want to sell something through your website, that is a very complicated set of things. I mean, there are companies that provide um, uh, that let you take credit card orders from different places, but usually they're limited to certain kinds of countries, like Western Europe, no problem. Some other countries, no problem. You get to the bigger economies like China, India, um, uh, I think, well, the different places um, where it's really pretty complicated. And in those countries, there are rules like, you have to have a company that's actually owned by citizens of that country and so on in order to be able to do this kind of business transaction there. And it gets really quite ornate. And I know for us, with just things like Wolfram Alpha Pro, where it's just individual purchases. Well, there are sort of enterprise type plans and things for universities and so on, but there are lots of individual purchases. That's been a big complicated mess to let people be able to purchase through local kinds of financial mechanisms in all these different countries. Really, really a complicated story and sort of complying with the local rules about how can you actually collect money in those countries is really complicated. Um, and I think sort of the question of I mean, particularly for something like Wolfram Alpha, where we're providing a lot of knowledge and information, there are certainly issues that have come up about, oh, this country doesn't want you to show this country border this way, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think those things are mostly do not rise to the level of you just can't have your website there. They're more like, oh, we don't want to use it because this or that thing. But I'm not sure. I'm not a big expert on those things. Um, let's see. Uh, let's see. Gosh, well, something from a interesting handle with lots of non-alphabetic characters, but I'll call them X paren, asks, learning to ask better questions seems to be arguably more relevant than ever before. How do you learn to ask better questions? I think practice really helps. I think that practice helps. Actually trying to answer the questions you ask I mean, the thing I do, I'm using Wolfram language and our technology and so on I wonder about something. I try and make it computational so I can get a computer to help me answer the question. Maybe sometimes it's a question where I'm just doing a web search or something to be able to answer the question. But still, I think it's kind of like getting into this rhythm of asking questions. So a typical thing would be, you see some claim, some news report, something like that. And there are questions like, you know, how could they possibly know if that's true? Or you see studies have shown that, left-handed people are more assertive than everybody else, so some such other thing. Um, and you say, well, really, what can is that really convincing? Might there be some other explanation? Might it be the case that, well, if you're not assertive, then if you're about equal left and right-handed, you'll end up following what other people do, and you'll be right, you'll play right-handed, so to speak, or whatever it is. I mean, it's kind of like you're told things, and like sort of, is that actually, is that even knowable? Somebody will say, you know, most foxes prefer green rather than blue or something. Well, is that actually knowable? Is that, could somebody do an experiment where they have lots of, foxes in the lab and they're showing them different things and they, say, does it look at that or does it look at this? There are these questions about sort of, being able to take things you're being told and ask questions based on that. That's a useful way to get practice. Another thing is just sort of the questions like, how did it come to be that way? Or you realize, oh, somebody's named their company whatever. Why did they do that? What did that mean? Or what, something is, there are lots of things that one is sort of information that one is confronted with where it's like, why is it that way? And can we understand that? And there are lots of things where one is trying to decide, I don't know, probably that's the single largest source of kind of questions one might ask is things that one hears about and then it's kind of like, well, I wonder about this thing that extends that thing that I heard about or that drills into that thing that I heard about. And I do think that sort of practice really helps. And I think that I know I do some stuff with kids where talk about lots of different kinds of things, but somehow it's just by seeing even somebody else kind of say, well, I wonder about this, I wonder about that. They kind of get the idea that you can wonder about these things. See, I think one of the problems with a lot of kind of education these days is education is just, you're told this is true, this is true, this is true. Here's delivered fact. And I think that it's kind of like that doesn't give you the kind of even the concept that you could ask questions. And one of the things that happens when you ask questions, it's kind of like you're learning science or some such other thing, and you'll ask a bunch of questions. And I'm always amused, I've or both in these live streams, but also things I've done sort of more in person with groups of kids and so on, that you'll get a stream of questions. And some of those questions are like, that's simple. That's in high school chemistry or something like that. Or actually, I don't know high school chemistry very well, but that's in sort of high school level science, whatever else. And then, oh, that's another question. Oh yeah, I happen to know the answer to that because I figured it out in doing science research, 30 years ago or something. Or I happen to know nobody knows the answer because I've wondered about that too, and I've asked a bunch of the world experts, and I can tell nobody knows the answer to that. And you so quickly go from, people don't know. It's very hard to know whether questions you ask are questions which are like elementary. If you don't know the field, if you really very well, it's very hard to know, is that an elementary question or is that a high-end research, nobody knows the answer type question? And often one of the things people get very kind of surprised by is that they can come up with questions where actually it's a research, nobody knows the answer type question, even though, well, it seemed kind of obvious. And unfortunately, in sort of the education system, there tends to be you're learning these things and you ask this question of some teacher and they're like, well, I don't know, but there isn't even the notion that it could be something that's out in the outer limits of what is known, so to speak. And I think that's sort of a thing to kind of to realize that you can ask questions that sort of take you to the outer limits of what's known or beyond, and that one can kind of, just thinking about stuff. It's like, oh, I wonder why, I don't know, I wonder why the night sky isn't full of stars, why there isn't a star in every direction that I look in the night sky. Okay, turns out that's not such a simple question to answer. And, because if there were enough stars, you would think any direction you look, there'll be a star. Well, let me not go and actually answer that question. But it's a thing where you might think that just at a very kind of, well, here's an example of a question that just came up very recently that I realized I'd never really asked before. So the question is, for life on Earth, are we life 1.0 or are we life 7.0, for example? Were there previous forms of life that created environments in which a future form of life could be cocooned, but had some very different structure? Like there could have been a first form of life that was based on, I don't know, silicates or something, but that had little pockets that it formed as the way that it worked. And in those pockets, life more like ours could be formed, and so on. And I realized I never asked that question before. It's sort of an obvious question, but I never asked that question before. And that's that's an example of something which, if you're just kind of, vaguely thinking about, well, life on Earth, did it arise once? Did it arise more than once? Were there a series of ways in which it arose and so on, where one created the environment for the next form of life and so on? It's sort of an obvious question, but not one that I thought to ask before. But again, I've been sort of trying to ask questions for a long time. So but nevertheless, one can always keep going and do better at that. I think another thing that I've tried to learn is like when you think about a project. Oh, I'm thinking about doing this project, or I'm thinking about suggesting this project to some student. There's a question of, is that project something the student is going to be able to do? And, we do these summer schools and high school summer research programs every year. And I get to come up with, I don't know, 140, 150 such projects every year. And the feedback mechanism of seeing what happens, you suggest a project, you see what happens, has certainly helped me to be better at scoping these things and figuring out how do you make projects where, you'll get something out of it. And then there's a sort of an extension where you can get more out of it, but kind of being able to foresee enough about how the project will work out to be able to know, even though I don't know the answer to the project, otherwise it sort of wouldn't be a project that was, I would consider kind of quotes worth doing, you kind of have to foresee enough and get the right intuition for whether this is something that is reasonably scoped to be able to be done. It's a little bit similar to the intuition about, is this a question that the answer is known to, or is this the type of question where nobody is going to know the answer? All right, I think I should wrap up here, but lots of interesting further questions that I didn't get to today. So I look forward to addressing them and others another time. Thanks very much, and bye for now.